It feels that the MOU in general, attempting to establish some kind of peace, it's placed on top of a alliance structure, which doesn't really permit it because the whole region is built up in terms of, well, yeah, an alliance system. That is the economic security architecture in which the Gulf states and the US is seeking to undermine Iran. So the fact that the Iranians would fear this dividing into two separate corridors, to undermine Iran's ability to shut it down, that seems reasonable because it's a continuation of the conflict. Now, my point isn't to fuel further distrust in the US, but it's suggesting that perhaps one needs a more profound solution that is a wider, economic security architecture, which is able to accommodate the
Totally.
Iranians to a greater extent. Because if it's a bit like in Europe. If you can, if you can move away from this block politics, where
Yeah.
the whole security, the whole economic architecture is essentially, yeah, block politics. If you can move, pull the Iranians into this, put some common deal between Oman and Iran to take, do the administration of these ships going in and out. Did you see the possibility though? Because one would think that as a result of, well, from reading the MOU, that the Iranians have strengthened their position in the region quite significantly, that there would have to be some change to the architecture, both the economic and
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have a piece in Foreign Policy that talks about exactly that. And this is what I think, unfortunately, is being jeopardized by this dual overreaction over this issue. Because again, this arrangement would only last for another 10 days before a final arrangement is negotiated. And that final arrangement is much, much more important in terms of whether a southern corridor actually is established that would be that threat to the Iranian leverage that they seek to have, which I think is, from their standpoint, having been attacked twice in the midst of negotiations by two nuclear weapon states. It's understandable that they're going to do everything they can to keep that leverage. But it's exactly that is actually jeopardized with this overreaction, because as part of the larger deal that should come about, and frankly, was moving in the direction, is to have a new architecture in the region in which Iran is rehabilitated. The Qataris, for instance, the prime minister has been actually explicit saying that they're looking for economic interdependence with the Iranians going forward. Now, it's clear that not all GCC states are on the same page on this issue. I think that the Bahrainis, for instance, the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis are probably of a different view. But even the Saudis, who matter far more, were planning to host a meeting, a session with the GCC plus Iran and Iraq to build confidence building measures that would be feeding into a new architecture. They even explicitly said that they've been studying the Helsinki process. And again, in my view, what I write in the Foreign Policy is that anything that returns to bloc formations is going to be detrimental to the region. It's really about getting rid of all of that and have a security architecture that is based on collective security, inclusive security, that by definition rejects bloc formation. That is the path that actually is open, but it requires the MOU to work and to be finalized. And it requires that in the intermediate, there's no overreaction by either side to temporary solutions for the Strait of Hormuz.
well, since you refer to the Helsinki process, I mean, this would also require the US to accept a very different role in the Middle East. Indeed, the Helsinki process beginning from 75, the Helsinki Accords moving forward, this was a key issue why the Cold War came to an end. But
Yeah.
Gorbachev, he made a comment in the last days or the last months of the Cold War, where he made the point that both the Soviets and the Americans had to address the hawks within their own camps, because once you abandon bloc politics, both the Soviets and the Americans would see their power diminished, because the bloc politics forms a power structure. Once peace breaks out, then suddenly why would your allies remain obedient to the same degree? And I think you saw earlier when the Chinese were pushing for improved relations between the Saudis and Iranians, again, the fear that peace might break out. You saw also the US recognizing this. That is, who's going to help them contain the Iranians? Why would the Gulf states listen to America if peace breaks out? So, how do you see this? Would the U.S. have to completely reconceptualize its role in the Middle East?
Yes, it would. And at the same time, I think it's important to recognize two things. One, even if it doesn't, the rest of the region is abandoning the idea of relying solely on the American security umbrella because it is proven to be unreliable, and its limits turn out to be stunning as a result of this war. So the very idea that existed before, which is that even if the US wanted to move itself out of the region, the GCC states would be pulling it back, Israel would be pulling it back. That is no longer the case, at least not to the same degree. These countries are not going to abandon the US or their relations with the US in a security sense, but they're not going to rely solely on it. And that in and of itself is going to break at least that element of the block formation to a certain extent. Now, you could go in the wrong direction and they just build additional block formations on top of it, which again, I think would be a mistake. But it's important to recognize that now we're in a scenario in which the demand from the GCC is not at all what it was prior to the war, because they've seen what that block formation leads to. It leads to a disastrous war in which the US bases are not protecting them. In fact, they're magnets for attacks. And on top of that, in that war, the United States did not prioritize the safety and the security of these states. It prioritized almost entirely Israel. So what's the point of this at the end of the day? It didn't deter the Iranians. It led to a war. And in that war, they couldn't rely on the US. So I think that most GCC states realize this. And as a result, the demand for that old formation is no longer there, at least not to the same extent. And then on the American side, you have thinking that is very different from what the Biden administration had. The Biden administration, if you remember, and you do very well, Glenn, because of all of the coverage that you did. I mean, they were all about strengthening the existing alliance system, and by that, sustaining existing enmities. And you needed those enmities in order to strengthen the alliance system. So they were really status quo. They didn't want to see any change whatsoever. And as a result, they reacted very negatively to the Saudi-Iranian deal and the Chinese role in it, because again, it showed the US is not the only game in town. Other states can intervene quietly. The Saudi intelligence chief was in Beijing for 5 days, and the US intelligence had no idea. It tells you how, limited the insight is. And some say that it was because the US was solely focused on something else, which was just Israel, and Israel's normalization, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't paying attention to these other things. So, and you have in the restraint community, of course, arguments that I know resonates at least with some in the Trump administration, which is the US should simply move away from its dominance in the Middle East. It's not paying off for the US. You have numerous American presidents for quite some time promising to get out of the Middle East. So it is not that controversial any longer for American politicians to be very explicit about this. I see this as a massive opportunity for the United States to turn this around and say, okay, let's have a different arrangement in the region that is not reliant on the United States. The US can move its bases and its forces out, focus on things that matter more to the US, while leaving the region in a state that is actually more stable than it was before, while the US actually retains good relations with the majority of those states, and perhaps also, thanks to the MOU succeeding, perhaps a decent relationship with Iraq. That's a huge win at the end of the day for the US as well.
Yeah, no, again, that's why these deals, which just tinker a little bit, try to make some minor changes, that's why I think they won't necessarily be able to accommodate this massive shift in the international distribution of power that is, again, the hegemonic order. This had two main implications, in my opinion. That was one, it would exhaust the United States, which it did, and the second would incentivize all of America's major opponents to essentially band together to collectively balance the US as opposed to balance each other. So, no, I think one has to adjust to the new world. I'm just wondering if politicians are able to do so, because at least I see in Europe we have a ideological political
Yeah.
class which can't imagine anything else than the world which is already over, and I think
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
creates a
Yeah.
strategic vacuum.
Yeah. So I think what you're pointing to is a limit to imagination and political will rather than that the opportunity does not exist. The opportunity clearly exists. In fact, the opportunity is begging for attention because the realities of powers have shifted away from what these politicians would like it to be. And this is where you have the paradox of the Trump administration. It has absolutely no path dependence whatsoever. So it is not path dependent to the previous structures. In fact, an argument of saying, well, this is what the US has always has done, I assume is a negative argument, a demerit in the eyes of the Trump administration because they constantly seek to be rupturing things. And I think there's also a tilt towards believing that they should be pulling out of the Middle East. But that is then accompanied with another problem, which is an administration that seems increasingly incapable of striking a single deal and holding on to it. The patience of Trump is very, very limited. I think one of the problems with the MOU and any negotiations with the Iranians is that Trump constantly needs positive reinforcement and constantly feel like he's moving in the right direction. And if he isn't, he has the capacity of just doing a 180 and moving the other direction, which may be what he's doing right now. Diplomacy in 12 days didn't work out, so screw it. I'm back to bombing. And then, in a couple of days, he's going to realize, well, that ain't going to work. And then he's going to try to go back to diplomacy, not realizing that others are not willing to play that game with him. But so you have a scenario in which there isn't that ideology, there isn't that path dependence, which creates a massive opportunity to actually do some of these shifts. But then on the other hand, you have an administration that, for a variety of reasons, is not staffed in the right way, is not having the top leadership with the patience that is needed to be able to actually make a massive change as this would be. Remember the NSS of December 2024. It was talking about hemispheric focus, getting out of the Middle East, and 2 months later, he starts the war with Iran.
Well, how do you see the regional actors, though, putting the United States aside? Because, you see a similar development in Europe. That is, the US can't be everywhere at the same time. The US begins to pull a bit back. But instead of, the Europeans reverting back to the Helsinki format of indivisible security, pan-European security, they essentially want to recreate Europe only NATO. So continue the bloc politics, but without its main player, which is, crazy proposition, if you ask me. But how does it look like in the Middle East? Do you think, as a result of this war, there could be a shift in relations between the Iranians, the Arabs, and the Turks?